the Weedmen. Now, on that night when I came to my watch, I discovered that there was no moon, and save for such light as the fire threw, the hilltop was in darkness. Yet this was no great matter to trouble me, for we had been unmolested since the fire of the burning fungi in the valley, and thus I had lost much of the haunting fear which beset me upon the death of Job. Yet, though I was not much as afraid as I had been, I took all precautions suggested themselves to me, and built up the fire to a goodly height, after which I took my cut and thrust and made the round of the camping place. On the edges of the cliffs, which protected us on 3 sides, I made some pause, staring down into the darkness and listening, though this latter was of but small use because of the strength of the wind which roared continually in my ears. But though I neither saw nor heard anything, I was presently possessed of a strange uneasiness, which made me return twice or thrice to the edge of the cliffs, but always without seeing or hearing anything to justify my superstitions. And so, presently, being determined to give way to no fancifulness, I avoided the boundary of the cliffs, and kept more to the part which commanded the slope, up and down which we made our journeys from the island below. And it would be near halfway through the time of my watching there came into me of the immensity of the weed that lay leeward, a far distant sound that grew upon my ear, rising and rising into a fearsome screaming and shrieking, and then dying away into the distance in queer sobs. And so the last 2 notes below that of the winds. At this, as might be supposed, I was somewhat shaken in myself to hear the dread noise coming out all that desolation. And then, suddenly as the thought came to me, the screaming was from the ship leeward of us, and I ran immediately to the edge of the cliff overlooking the weed, stared into the darkness, but now I perceived by the light which burned in the hulk that the screaming had come from some place great distance to the right of her, and more, as my sense assured me, it could by no means been possible for those in her to have sent their voices to me against such a breeze as blew that time. And so, for a space I stood nervously pondering and peering into the darkness of the night. Thus, in a little I perceived a dull glow upon the horizon, and presently there rose into our view the upper edge of the moon, and a very welcome sight it was for me, for I had been upon the point of calling the boatswain to inform him regarding the sound which I heard. But I hesitated, being afraid to seem foolish if nothing should befall. Then, even as I stood watching the moon rise into view, there came again to me the beginning of that screaming, somewhat likened to the sound of a woman sobbing with a giant's voice. And it grew and strengthened until it pierced through the roar of the wind with amazing clearness, and then slowly, seeming to echo and echo, it sank away into the distance, and there it was again in my ears, no sound beyond that of the wind. At this, having looked fixedly in the direction of the sound had proceeded, I ran straight away to the tent and roused the boatswain, for I had no knowledge of what the noise might portend, and this second cry had shaken me from all my bashfulness. Now the boatswain was up upon his feet almost before I had made the end of shaking him, and catching up his great cutlass, which he kept by his side, he followed me swiftly out from the hilltop. Here I explained to him that I had heard a very fearsome sound which appeared to proceed out of the vastness of the wee continent, and that, upon repetition of the noise, I had decided to call him, for I knew not what that might signal to us some coming danger. And that the boatswain commended me, though chiding me that I had hesitated to call him from the first occurrence of the crying. And then, following me to the edge of the leeward cliff, he stood there with me, waiting and listening. Perchance there might come again a recurrence of the noise. For perhaps something over an hour we stood there very silent and listening, but there came no sound beyond the continuous noise of the wind. And so, by that time, having grown somewhat impatient of waiting, and the moon being well risen, the boatswain beckoned to make the round of the camp with him. Now, just as I turned away, chancing to look downward at the clear water directly below, I was amazed to see innumerable multitude of great fish unlike those I had seen on the previous night. They were swimming from the wee continent towards the island, and that I stepped near the edge, where they came so directly towards the island and I expected to see them closer inshore. Yet I could not perceive one, for they all seemed to vanish at some 30 yards distant from the beach, and at that being amazed by both the numbers of the fish and their strangeness, in which they came on continually, yet never reached the shore. I paused to pose and come and see, for he had gone on a few paces. Upon hearing my call, he came running back where I pointed to the sea below. At that, he stood forward and peered very intently, and I with him. And yet neither one of us could discover the meaning of so curious an exhibition. And for a while we watched. The bosun, being quite so, as much interested as I. Presently, however, turned away, saying we did foolishly to stand here peering at every curious sight, when we should be looking into the welfare of the camp. And so we began to go the round of the hilltop. And now, whilst we had been watching and listening, we had suffered the fire to die down to an almost unwise lowness. And consequently, though the moon was rising, there was by no means the same brightness that should have made the camp light. On perceiving this, I went forward to throw some fuel onto the fire, and then, even as I moved, it seemed to me that I saw something stir in the shadow of the tent, and at that I ran towards the place, uttering a shout and waving my cotton thrust. Yet I found nothing, and so, feeling somewhat foolish, I turned to make up the fire, and as seen my intention, and whilst I was thus busied, the bosun came running over to me, know what I have seen, and in the same instant there ran 3 men out of the tent, all of them waked by my sudden cry. But I had not to tell them, save that my fancy had played a trick. It had shown me something where my eyes could find nothing. And at that, 2 of the men went back to resume their sleep. But the third, a big fellow whom the bosun had given the other cutlass, came without bringing his weapon, though he kept silent. It seemed to me he had gathered something of our uneasiness, and for my part, I was not sorry to have his company. Presently, we came to that portion of the chill which overhung the valley when I went to the edge of the cliff, intending to peer over, for the valley had very unholy fascination for me. Yet, no sooner had I glanced down than I started, and ran back to the bosun and poked him by the sleeve, at that perceiving my agitation he came with me in silence, to see the matter that caused me so much excitement. Now when he looked over, he was also astounded, and drew back instantly. Then, using great caution, he bent forward once more and stared down. And at that, the big seaman came up behind, walking upon his toes, and stooped to see what the manner of the thing we discovered. Thus, each of us stared down at an almost unearthly sight. For in the valley all beneath us was a swarm with moving creatures, white and unwholesome in the moonlight, and their movements were somewhat like the movements of the monstrous slugs, though the things themselves had no resemblance to such their contours. It reminded me of naked humans, very fleshy and crawling upon their stomachs, yet the movements lacked not a surprising rapidity. Now, looking over a little of the bosun's shoulders, I discovered that these hideous things were coming up from the pit-like pool in the bottom of the valley, and suddenly I was reminded of the multitudes of strange fish which we had seen swimming towards the inland, but which had all disappeared before reaching the shore. And I had no doubt that they entered the pit through some natural passage known to be beneath the water. And now I made to understand my thought of the previous night, that I had seen the flicker of tentacles, for these things below us had two short, stumpy arms. But the ends appeared divided into hateful and wriggling masses of small tentacles, which slid hither and thither as the creatures moved above the bottom of the valley, and at their hindered ends they should have grown feet, but there seemed other flickering branches. But it must not be supposed that we saw things clearly. Now, it is scarcely plausible to convey the extraordinary disgust which the sight of these human slugs bred in me, nor could do I think I would, for if were I successful, then the others be like to retch even as I did, the spasm coming on without premonition. But heavy horror, born of every horror, and then, suddenly, even as I stared, sick with loathing and apprehension, there came into view, not a fathom below my feet, a face like to the face which appeared into my own on that night, as we drifted beside the weed continent. At that, I could have screamed. Then had I been in less terror, for the great eyes, so big as crown pieces, in the bill, like an inverted parrot's, and the slug-like ulating of its white and slimy body bred me into the dumbness of one mortally stricken. And even as I stayed there, my helpless body bent and rigid, the bosun spat a mighty curse into my ear, and leaning forward, smote at the thing with his cutlass. For in an instant that I had seen it, it had advanced upwards by so much as a yard. And now this action of the bosun's, I came suddenly into possession of myself and thrust downward so much bigger that I had to be followed upon the brute's carcass. For I overbalanced, danced giddily for a moment upon the edge of eternity. And then the bosun had me by the waistband, and I was back in safety. But in an instant in which I had struggled for my balance, I discovered that the face of the cliff was near hid with a number of things which were making up to us. And I turned to the bosun, crying out to him that there were thousands of them swimming up to us. Yet he was gone already from me, running towards the fire, and shouting at the men in the tent to haste to help for their lives, for help for their very lives. And then racing back with an armful of the weed, and after him came the big seamen carrying a burning tuft from the campfire. And in so few minutes we had a blaze, and the men bringing more weed, for we had a very good stock upon the hilltop, for which the Almighty be thanked. Now, when we lit one fire, then the bosun cried out to the big seamen to make another further along the edge of the sea cliff. and in the same instant, I shouted and ran over to the part of the hill which lay towards the open sea, for I'd seen a number of moving things about the edge of the seaward cliff. Now, here and there was a deal of shadow, for there was scattered certain large masses of rocks about this part of the hill, and held off both the light of the moon and that from the fires. Here I came abruptly upon three great shapes moving with a stealthiness towards the camp, and behind these I dimly saw there were others. Then with a loud cry for help, I made at the three as an eye charged. They rose up and at me, and I fought that they overtopped me, and their vile tentacles outreached at me. Then I was smiting, grasping a stick with a sudden stench, the stench of the creatures which I had already come to know. And when something clutched at me, something slimy and vile, great mandibles clamped in my face, but I stabbed upward, and the thing fell from me, leaving me dazed and sick and smiting weakly. There came the rush of feet behind me and a sudden blaze as the bosun crying out encouragement, and directly then he and the big seamen thrust themselves in front of me, hurling from them great masses of burning weed which they had borne each of them upon a long reed. And immediately things were gone, slithering hastily down over the cliff edge. And so, presently, I was more my own man, and made to wipe from my throat the slime left by the clutch of the monster. And afterwards, I ran from fire to fire with weed, feeding them and so space passed, during which we had safety. But for by that time we had fires all about the top of the hill, and the monsters were mortal dread of fire, else we had been dead, all of us, that night. Now, a while before the dawn, we had discovered for a second time, since we had been upon the island, that our fuel could not last us the night after which we compelled to burn it. So the bosun told to let out every second fire, and thus we staved off for a while the time when we had to face the spell of the darkness, and the things which present the fires held them off from us. And so at last we had come to the edge of the weed and reeds, and the bosun called out to us to watch the cliff edges very carefully, and smite on the instant after anything showed. But that, should he call, all were to gather by the central fire for one last stand, and after that he blasted the moon which passed behind a great bank of clouds. Thus the matters were, and the gloom deepened as the fire sank lower and lower. Then I heard a man curse on that part of the hill which lay towards the sea continent. His crying came up against the wind, and the bosun shouted us all to have a care. And directly afterwards I smote at something that rose so slightly above the edge of the cliffs opposite where I watched. Perhaps a minute passed, and there came shouts from all parts of the hilltop, and I knew that the Mead men were upon us. And in the same instant, there came two above the edge near me, rising with ghostly quietness, yet moving lithely. And now, for first I pierced somewhere in the throat and it fell backward. For the second, though I thrust it through, caught my blade with a bunch of its tentacles, and was like to have snatched it from me, but I kicked it in the face, and at that, being, I believe, more astonished than hurt, it loosed my sword and immediately fell away out of sight. Now this had taken all in all more than 10 seconds, yet already I perceive so many as 4 others coming into the view of my right, and that it seemed to me that our deaths must be very near. For I knew not how we were to cope with the creatures coming as they were so boldly with such rapidity. Yet I hesitated not, but ran at every one of them, and now I thrust not, but cut at their faces, and found this to be very effectual, for in this wise disposed I of 3 and many strokes, but the 4th had come right over the cliff edge and rose upon me. Its hinder parts, and had done those others when the boatswain had succored me. At that I gave way, having a very lively dread, but hearing all about me the cries of conflict, and knowing I could expect no help, I made at the brute, and as it stooped and reached one of its bundles of tentacles, I sprang back and slashed at them, and immediately I followed up by a thrust in the stomach, and it came collapsing into a writhing white ball. And I rolled this way and that, and so in its agony coming to the edge of the cliff, it fell over, and I was left sick and near helpless with hateful stench of the brutes. Now, by this time, all the fires about the edges of the hill were sunken into dull glowing mounds of embers. Though that which burnt near to the entrance of our tail was still of good brightness, yet this helped us but little, for we fought too far beyond the immediate circle of its beams to benefit from it. And still the moon, at which now I threw a despairing glance, was no more than a ghostly shape behind the great bank of cloud which was passing over it. Then, even as I looked upward, glancing at its might be over my left shoulder, I saw, with a sudden horror, that something had come anigh me upon the instant. I got the reek of the thing and leapt fearfully to one side, turning as I sprang. Thus I was saved in the very moment of my destruction, for the creature's tentacles smeared the back of my neck as I leapt in, and I had smitten once again and conquered. Immediately after this, I discovered something to be crossing the dark space that lay between the double mound of the nearest fire and that which lay further along the hilltop. So, wasting no moment of time, I ran towards the thing and cut a trace along the head before I even get upon its hind parts, in which I had leave greatly to dread them. Yet no sooner had I slain this one than came a rush of maybe a dozen upon me. These having climbed silently over the cliff edge in the meanwhile. At this, I dodged, and I ran madly towards the glowing mound of the nearest fire, the brutes following me almost so quick as I could run. But I came to the fire first, and with a sudden thought coming to me, I thrust the point of my cotton thrust among the embers, and switched a great shower of them at the creatures. And at that, I had momentary clear vision of many white, hideous faces stretched out towards me, and brown, clamping mandibles, which had the upper beak shutting into the lower, and they clamped wrinkled tentacles were all in a flutter. Then the glue came again, but immediately I switched, and yet another shower of burning embers towards them. And so, directly I saw them get back, and then they were gone. At this, all about the edges of the hilltop, I saw the fires being scattered in like manner. For the others have adopted this device to help them in their sore straits. For a little while after this, I had a short breathing space, and the brutes seeming to have taken flight. Yet I was full of trembling, and I glanced hither and thither, not knowing when one or more of them would come upon me. And I ever glanced towards the moon and prayed that the almighty cloud would pass. Else should we all be dead men. Then, as I prayed, there rose a sudden and very terrible scream from one of the men. And in the same moment there came something over the edge of the cliff, fronting me, but I cleft it or ever it could rise higher, and in my ears echoes still the sudden scream from which I come from the part of the hill which lay to the left of me. Yet I dare not leave my station, for to have done so would have risked all. And so I stayed, tortured by the strain of ignorance and my own terror. Again, I had a little spell in which I was free from the molestation, nothing coming into sight so far as I could see to the right or left of me, though others were less fortunate, as the curses and sounds of blows told me. And then abruptly there came another cry of pain, and I looked again to see the moon, and prayed aloud that it might come out to show me some light before we were all destroyed. But it remained hid. Then a sudden thought came into my brain, and I shouted at the top of my voice to the bosom to set the great pole upon the central fire, for thus we should have a big blaze, the wood being very nice and dry. Thrice I shouted to him, saying, "Burn the bow! Burn the bow!" And immediately he replied, shouting the old men to carry it to the fire. And this we did, bore it in the center of the fire, and ran back with all our speed to our places. Thus a minute we had some light, and the light grew as the fire took hold of the great log, the wind fanning it to a blaze. And so I faced outwards, looking to see if any vile face showed above the edge before me, to my right or my left. Yet I saw nothing, save, as it seemed to me, once a fluttering tentacle came up a little under my right, but nothing else bore space. Perhaps it was 5 minutes later that there came another attack, and in this I came near to losing my life through my folly in venturing too near to the edge of the cliff. For suddenly there shot up from the darkness below a clump of tentacles and caught me about the left ankle. Immediately I was pulled into a sitting posture, so that both my feet were over the edge of the precipice. and it was only the mercy of God that I had not plunged head foremost into the valley. Yet as I suffered a mighty whirl, for the brute had my foot, I put vast strain upon it, trying to pull me down, but I resisted, using my hands and seek to sustain me, and discovering that it cannot compass the end in this wise, it slacked somewhat of the stress, and bit at my foot, shearing through the hard leather and nigh destroying my small toe. But now, being no longer compelled to use both hands to retain my position, I slashed down with a great fury, being maddened by the pain and the mortal fear the creature had put upon me. Yet I was not immediately free of the brute, for it caught my sword blade, but I snatched it away before it could take proper hold, perhaps cutting its feelers somewhat thereby. Though of this I cannot be sure, for they seem not to grip around a thing, but suck to it. Then by lucky blow, I maimed it, so it loosed me and I was able to get back into some condition of security. And from us onwards, we were free from molestation, though we had no knowledge that the quietness of the weed men did not portend a fresh attack. And so, at last, it came to the dawn, and all this time the moon come not to our help. But being quite hid behind the clouds which cover up the whole arc of the sky, making the dawn of a very desolate aspect. And soon, as was sufficiency of light, we examined the valley, but there were nowhere any of these weed men, no, nor any of their dead, for it seemed they had carried off all such and their wounded, and so we had no opportunity to make examination of the monsters by daylight. Yet, though we could not come upon their dead, all about the cliff edge was blood and slime. From the latter came ever a hideous stench which marked the brutes. But from this we suffered little, the wind carrying it far away to the leeward, and filling our lungs with sweet and wholesome air. Presently, seeing that the danger was past, the boatswain called to us the scent of fire which burnt still the remnants of the great bow. And here we discovered the first time of the men. One of the men was gone from us. At that, we made search of the hilltop, and afterwards in the valley, and about the island, but found him not.